I feel like there's a lot of misconception behind what makes a card unbalanced. A lot of people see the word unbalanced and they immediately think that it's referring to a card that is extremely broken and has high usage rates. However, I think there's dual meaning to it. While half of it can be attributed to high usage rates and broken mechanics, I also think a card is unbalanced if a card has extremely low usage rates despite multiple balance changes, or has mechanics that just don't fit within the landscape of Clash Royale, and therefore it's just impossible for Clash Royale to make viable, or impossible for Clash Royale to keep a card at a healthy usage rate. So in this video, I want to look at cards that despite many balance changes have never been viable or have always been strong regardless of the meta, and therefore find out what is the most unbalanced card in Clash Royale history. When the evolved Goblin Drill was released into Clash Royale, people said it would be the most broken evolution to date, and this was fair enough, since the drill was literally uncounterable without overspending.
I physically can't counter this right now. I'm panicking. That's evolution drill. That's ridiculous.
The fact that it would pop up 3 times at different positions on the tower, as well as spawn goblins every time the drill popped back into the ground, made it so that you would have to either place 3 cards for the 3 times it popped back up, or you would have to cop the damage. The fact that not even normal drill counters like Valkyrie or Royal Ghost could counter it, shows that it was designed to directly overcome its counter. On top of that, it would also knock back troops and deal damage every time it resurfaced. The reason the Evo drill was such a menace was because it forced the opponent to place cards in vulnerable positions where something like an Evo Bomber or a Goblin Demolisher could lock onto the tower. So the opponent would either take damage from the drill or take damage from the evolved bomber or whatever troop was played. Clash Royale nerfed the drill twice, first by reducing the number of goblins spawned on death. Even though this seemed like a good change, the fact that it spawned goblins was the issue, not the number of goblins. So the drill was still extremely strong. The issue was that it would just start spawning goblins straight away, which wouldn't give enough time for the opponent's cards to walk up to it. Clash Royale fixed this by adding a delay for spawning when the drill went back into the ground and came back up. This change killed the card, since now it was super easy to counter with cheap cycle cards. I think the Evo drill is easily one of the most unbalanced cards, because it depends on a broken mechanic to be viable. Otherwise, it's a waste of an Evo slot. If the drill doesn't spawn goblins when it goes into the ground, it becomes easy to counter, making it a useless card. But if it spawns goblins when going into the ground, it becomes extremely difficult to counter for an even elixir trade, since you would need to spend more elixir to kill the goblins and deal with the next wave of the drill. The issue is that evolution slots are valuable, so if the Evo drill doesn't have its broken mechanic, it's not worth using it over a regular drill. The evolved Goblin Drill has never had healthy usage and win rates. It's either one of the most used evolutions in the game or it's one of the worst evolutions in the game, easily making it one of Clash Royale's most unbalanced cards. The Goblinstein is a really unique idea for a card, but I personally think it doesn't really feel like a Clash Royale card. It just has such a strange ability, and it felt so different to have a single card made of 2 characters that look like they could be their own card. But the issue with the Goblinstein is it's just extremely unbalanced. The Goblinstein literally does everything. It provides split lane pressure, it can counter air cards, it can counter ground cards, it can counter swarm cards, it can stun cards, and it can also kite cards to the opposite lane. The issue is that if a card can do everything but it can't do any one of these things extremely well, it's either going to be used in basically every type of deck or it won't be used at all. Since the Goblinstein was genuinely a strong card on release, it was extremely popular. The Doctor had too much health and the ability did way too much damage. The monster was actually the most balanced part of the troop, and even that part was too strong. But now that it's been nerfed, you can't really use it in any deck, since there's nothing it excels in compared to any other card. I think the Goblinstein is really problematic as a card, since if Clash Royale wants to buff it now, it's gonna shoot right back up to being one of the best cards in the game, since it's already a versatile card and a small boost goes a long way. But on the other hand, if Clash Royale keeps it like it is now, it's only gonna get more and more irrelevant, since players can just use other champions in their deck and other cards. I think the way that the card's being designed means that it's extremely hard to balance, since Clash Royale has to balance the Doctor, the monster, as well as the ability all in one card. Overall, it's kind of crazy how much the Goblinstein controls game balance, since its strength can literally define the meta, and I think the game would genuinely be a much more balanced landscape if this card was deleted from the game. That's how unbalanced it really is. Easily one of the most unbalanced cards in Clash Royale history. I don't know if this is on purpose, but I feel like every card released in the last year or so has been really unbalanced. I don't know if this is because Clash Royale is experimenting with new game mechanics or there are other reasons for this, but the Void spell had the potential to be a balanced card, but Clash Royale kind of took the wrong route to balancing the card, and now they have abandoned it. It's probably the only spell in the game where a bigger spell radius is actually a nerf rather than a buff. The idea behind the Void was really smart, since if you hit a single troop, it would deal massive amounts of damage, but you took the risk of either the opponent predicting you or your Void hitting other troops, whereby the damage would be way reduced. The Void on release was way too OP, since your opponent would only have like half a second to react to the Void. Otherwise, troops like Archer Queens, Musketeers, and Witches could be eliminated for a positive elixir trade, and 0.5 seconds was like no time at all, not even accounting for the lag that most players would experience. So basically, it was like a lightning spell for 3 elixir, so it's not surprising that it recorded a whopping 32% usage rate within 2 weeks of its release. But as soon as Clash Royale nerfed the one thing that made the Void OP, the card suffered. The Void was a below average spell if the opponent could make sure other troops were in the radius, and this could be achieved if they had more time to react to it. By increasing the duration between the spell's radius showing and the first strike, this made it so much easier to react to the Void, since it wouldn't be a basically insta-damage spell like it was before, but the damage output of the Void was still way too high. After Clash Royale nerfed the damage output of the Void so it wasn't too strong for a 3 elixir card, the card was basically dead. The unpredictability of the Void made it viable, but the issue is that the Void was just too strong when the strikes were fast, but the Void is too weak when the strikes can be better anticipated with longer intervals between the strikes. The issue is that Clash Royale can't balance the card now without it being one of the best damage dealing spells in the game, or for it to remain completely irrelevant. The Void spell is truly a doomed spell. The only buff that Clash Royale can give it now is either a little damage buff or a faster attack time interval, but these buffs can easily turn the Void spell into a top 5 spell in Clash Royale if it isn't executed properly. On the other hand, if Clash Royale keeps it in its current state, the Void will just become less and less relevant as time goes on. I've already mentioned this in another video, but I think tower troops are fun if they're balanced. But the thing is, it's really difficult to balance something that can make or break a matchup. For example, Logbait does terribly against Dagger Duchess, but does very well against Cannoneer. It's all a game of rock, paper, scissors, which I'm not a fan of, and I don't think many players want to take this gamble, especially when they start to become more competitive. But I think the Royal Chef is one of the weirdest tower troops in the game, since the pancake ability is so game-breaking it's not even funny. The fact that he can level up troops to higher levels is so insane, since this changes so many little interactions and is basically impossible to balance. When the Royal Chef was first added to the game, his damage output was almost the same as a Princess Tower, and considering that he would level up troops so often, this made him absolutely broken. The issue with the Royal Chef is that he only really works with heavier decks such as beatdown decks, since a higher level Golem or Lava Hound is so much more useful than having a higher level Goblin in a Goblin gang, since the pancake only applies to single troops. This meant that he buffed beatdown, but also indirectly nerfed cycle and bait. The fact that tower troops, which is something that should be insignificant, can define a meta shows how broken he really is as a card. When Clash Royale inevitably had to nerf the frequency of pancakes being thrown, the card lost what made it overpowered. So most of the time it isn't really useful, since it's now basically a worse Princess Tower. The issue with the Royal Chef is that you can't really control who he gives the pancake to, so you either have to strategically drop your troops, or risk the pancake being given to a cycle card like a Fire Spirit or an Ice Spirit, and then have to wait like 20 seconds for it to charge back up again. I think the Royal Chef in its current state is somewhat balanced in the sense that he's not extremely overpowered, but in terms of his position in the game, I think he is one of the worst tower troops. In his entire lifetime in the game, he has either been the best or the worst tower troop with no in-betweens. I think a lot of people expected me to include the Battle Healer in this list, because this card is a balancing nightmare for Supercell, and if I were in the balancing team's shoes, I wouldn't really know what to do with this card. In this card's 4.5 year existence, it has been in the balance changes 8 times and it's still unbalanced, and there has never been a time where the Battle Healer has seen healthy usage rates. It has either been one of the most used cards in the game, or one of the worst cards in the game, with literally no in between. And even if it's not really heavily used, I still feel like the decks that she's played in are so toxic that it's just an annoying card to go up against. The heal mechanic is so unhealthy for the game, since it alters many interactions, and aside from evolutions, I don't think the heal mechanic has ever been executed well by Clash Royale. I think they need to completely rework the healer if they want to make her work in Clash Royale, rather than giving her small tweaks like they have been doing currently. I know I said this already about how recent card releases are unbalanced, but I think the Rune Giant is the definition of an unbalanced card. The idea of a troop being able to enchant other troops in itself is so broken, since it introduces way too many new interactions, and it seems like it would be so hard to balance. When the Rune Giant was released, her enchant ability, which would provide damage amplification on every third attack of a troop, seemed quite balanced, but since it disappeared 5 seconds after the Rune Giant died, it made it kind of useless, since the Rune Giant wouldn't stay alive long enough for it to be worth it. So it was basically an ice golem for 2 or more elixir with a weird gimmick that was useless in basically 99% of matches. However, when Clash Royale buffed it shortly after it was released so that the buff would stay on troops forever rather than a short time, this made the Rune Giant absolutely broken. She went from being her bottom 5 card to one of the best cards in the game with a single change to her stats. If that doesn't show how terribly balanced this card is, I don't know what will. The issue is that the enchant ability worked really well with specific cards like the Hunter, the Goblin Giant, and the Dark Goblin, since those cards would either have multiple projectiles or have a fast hit speed, which meant that the enchant would be most effective. This version of the Rune Giant would lead to an extremely toxic meta, with all of these cards having at least a 25% usage rate.
There has been a new tweet by Muhammad Light and a bunch of other people, but we're going to be highlighting this one in specific. He says, these 2 cards need to be deleted, and honestly, I fully agree with him, man. What I just want to say is, like, I can't believe they gave a card an emergency buff. Like, we have been begging for them to nerf these cards for so long, like, for example, the Goblinstein, and they refused to nerf it for the longest time, right? And then they finally nerf it, and it's still broken, but what do? Instead of nerfing stuff, they just emergency buff units. Like, what is that? Like, what is an emergency buff? Why are we doing emergency buffs? Like, I actually can't believe it.
The Rune Giant was only specifically used in these decks for the damage amplifying effect. It really meant nothing else. So when Clash Royale inevitably had to nerf it since it was inflating usage rates of already balanced cards, the only thing Clash Royale could realistically do was to nerf it so that its buff would disappear after a certain amount of time. Anything else that Clash Royale would do would still make the card overpowered. With this nerf, the card was once again a dead card, and even today it sits at basically a 0% usage rate in top 200. If the Rune Giant's effect lasts forever, the card will be absolutely broken, and as soon as Clash Royale nerfs the stat of the card, it basically becomes useless. The fact that the Rune Giant entirely depends on her enchant ability to be viable, combined with the fact that the enchant ability is extremely unbalanced, makes the Rune Giant one of the most unbalanced cards in Clash Royale history. And I know Clash Royale has given up on balancing the Rune Giant, since the last couple of balance changes they've given her have basically reverted her to her original release stats, which they already knew wasn't going to be viable. I decided to put the mirror and the clone together for this one, since I feel like they suffer the same issue on why they are so unbalanced. Their concepts have just never really worked out in Clash Royale, which means that their value factor only really works in basically 20% of matches, and the other 80% they will provide very little value. This means that they are basically always going to be heavily underused if they are kept even slightly on the weaker side, since in the end, the risk of getting these cards to pay off is not worth wasting a card slot on, and potentially losing games for, especially in competitive Clash Royale, where these cards are more difficult to play, since more skillful players can better adapt to their gimmicks. This is also the reason that even if these cards are on the stronger side, not only does it unhealthily boost usage rates of other cards and make the game more toxic, but also, it won't really be successful as a long-term strategy, since it depends on the gimmick to have success, even at a low success rate. Another thing about these cards, especially with the mirror, is that they piggyback on other cards' success to do well. The clone isn't really something that works well with strong cards, but the mirror definitely is, since stronger cards would typically still be strong even at 1 more elixir, with the best examples being the Day 1 Phoenix and the Day 1 Goblin Machine. This means that if a meta doesn't have an extremely broken card that works well with mirror, then the card is just gonna be useless. But if the meta revolves around broken cards that would thrive even if they were more expensive, then the mirror will do well. There is literally no in between with these cards. I would argue that clone is worse than mirror, since the clone is useless even in the metas where strong cards are broken, since the clone only really synergizes with a total of like 10 cards in the game. So as long as these 10 cards are really popular, clone does really well, but otherwise it's terrible. So basically, the clone and the mirror suffer from the same issue, where they depend on the strength of other cards to do well, and they also have mechanics that don't really work in over 80% of matches, making them some of the most unbalanced cards of all time. I feel like the Evolved Wizard is a pretty balanced evolution in its current state, since it makes the normal wizard not absolutely terrible, but the normal wizard is easily one of the most unbalanced cards in the game. The wizard is a unique card, since it's one of the only cards on this list that's unbalanced because it's always been very weak. At least some of the other cards on this list were broken at some point in their existence. I talked about this in my video of the worst cards, but the wizard is impossible to rework, since he is a popular card for newer players since his mechanics are really straightforward. You just know that the card you're getting is going to be a reliable splash attacker, and for newer players, sticking to these simple mechanics rather than delving into complex mechanics just doesn't make sense. However, this makes the wizard pretty terrible in competitive play, since his simple mechanics make him really easy to counter, but also, he has a really low versatility, since he only really has very basic mechanics that make him inferior to other cards. I would honestly rank the wizard lower if it weren't for his evolution, since at least his evolution is one of the more balanced cards in the game, where his Evo ability isn't too OP, but it still allows it to overcome one of the wizard's main counters, while also giving him some extra versatility. Before the Furnace and Goblin Heart reworks, offensive spawners were easily some of Clash Royale's most unbalanced cards. And when I say offensive spawners, I'm of course talking about the Goblin Heart, Furnace, and Barb Heart. I think the Tombstone is actually one of Clash Royale's most balanced cards, which is such an insane parallel, since it literally works in the exact same way as the other spawners. I feel like it just goes to show that conceptually, the old Furnace, Goblin Heart, and Barb Heart was so terrible. The thing that made these old spawners so bad is that they could never do anything really well. As an offensive card, they were pretty terrible, since the chip damage they would get was not only easy to deal with, but also it was so insignificant that it was just a waste of elixir and a card slot. And on defense, they were also just so terrible, since they only periodically spawned troops, which meant that you wouldn't even get troops when you would need them the most, which is one of the reasons that the reworked Goblin Heart is such a great card, since it's purely a defensive card, which is so good because it means that Clash Royale doesn't have to worry about balancing its offensive and defensive abilities. And the thing is, these spawners have never really had healthy usage rates. They either defined the meta because they were on the strongest side, or they have been at the bottom of the usage rate charts. This one was pretty obvious, but the Witch has to be one of the most unbalanced cards of all time, and the release of the evolution made things worse, since Clash Royale added one of the most unbalanced mechanics, which is healing, onto one of the most unbalanced cards. The Witch has received 18 balance changes throughout her entire existence, and the Evolved Witch has received 4 balance changes in less than 5 months of the card being in the game. So over her 9-year existence in this game, the Witch has received 22 balance changes in total, and despite this, she is still so terribly balanced. I feel like Clash Royale made the balancing issue with the Witch even worse with her evolution. The Witch has only ever really been the best card in the game, for instance during October 2019 or May 2025 with the Evolved Witch, or literally the worst card in the game for basically all of its life. It is probably the most unbalanced troop of all time, but I still feel like she isn't quite the most unbalanced card of all time. The heal spell was such an unhealthy card for Clash Royale that it had to be removed, which is kind of insane to think about. As I already talked about with the battle healer, having a heal mechanic is so unhealthy for the game, but putting it on a spell makes this issue even worse. A lot of the unbalanced cards on this list have been spells, since spells can either be extremely niche or very versatile simply because of their ability and complexity of mechanics, which means that spell usage rates are always going to be weirder than normal cards, since some spells are just not as versatile as others by design. And the heal spell is one of these. The types of interactions where the heal spell would do well was so rare and insignificant that it wasn't even worth wasting a card slot on a card with a terribly balanced mechanic. The heal spell had 4 major balance changes throughout its 3-year existence in Clash Royale, and despite all of these major changes, it still remained one of the worst cards of all time, aside from the one time in 2017 where 3 Musketeers was meta, and the heal spell was very popular. I think most of the changes to the heal spell did nothing to its usage, since they were just basic buffs such as increasing its radius and changing its placement mechanics, but the major rework in 2019 that made the card 1 elixir from 3 elixir but heavily reduced its healing is the one that I think was the change that proved that there was nothing that Clash Royale could do to make this card viable, since even at 1 elixir, the heal was a terrible card. The heal spell has to be the most unbalanced card of all time, and I don't think there is any contention to this. I hope you enjoyed this video though. Thanks for watching.